everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream, the great guest I think you're really going to enjoy. Before we get started today, I just want to remind you that one of the ways we keep the lights on around here is subscriptions to Blaze TV. So if you head to blazetv.com/Auron, you can support everything we do here on the show. You'll get $20 off your subscription and you'll get access to all your favorite Blaze TV hosts and all the behind the scenes stuff. So head over to blazetv.com/Auron to get $20 off today. All right, guys, we've all heard the generational discourse online. We hear that it's all the Gen Z kids, it's all the millennials, the boomers. How could they have done this to us? Should we be raging at each other all the time? Is that the way society is supposed to work? The different generations attacking each other, tearing each other apart? Or should we be thinking about a generational legacy, a continuity of tradition that passes down from one to the next, what we're about? Joining me today to talk about this is an author who has been doing great work on this on his Substack and now has written a great book about it. Johann Kurtz, thank you so much for coming on.
Thank you, Auron. It's a pleasure and I'm honored to be here.
Absolutely. Like I said, I've really enjoyed your work. You've been focusing a lot on how young men become leaders. They become strong. They become family leaders. They become the heads of households. They go into the church. All these critical things that seem to have fallen out of fashion as people are trying to find their way in this world and they don't understand where they fit in society, what their roles should be, how they should be interacting with the opposite sex or their elders or children. It's been great to just see someone go back to the basics and ask fundamental question of why aren't we forming families? How can we do better at this? So I'm really glad that you have been writing on this and it's all kind of culminated in this book. We'll get deeper into the issue of leaving a legacy. But before we do, guys, let's hear from today's sponsor. Everyone knows that college is a major investment, so it's really important to do your research. You want to find a school that shares your values, but who has the time to dig through all those college websites? Well, today I've got great news for you. There's a free, easy-to-use resource that does the work for you. It's called ChristianCollegeGuide.com. This online directory of over 250 Christian colleges and universities is a one-stop shop. ChristianCollegeGuide.com lists all the basics such as acceptance rates, tuition costs, and academic majors. But here's what makes this resource truly special. ChristianCollegeGuide.com will show you the school's faith commitments, its campus policies, and its spiritual life. All the info that you will need to find the college you can trust. This is the definitive college guide for Christian higher education, and it's completely free. So if you or someone you know is considering college, go to ChristianCollegeGuide.com to create a free user profile and start today. It's ChristianCollegeGuide.com. All right, Johann, we'll start with, I think, what is probably the easiest part of this discussion, something that frames your book ultimately, but you feel like it shouldn't have to be discussed. This is something that was kind of automatic throughout history, but the question has come up, and the easiest thing to point to is, of course, the boomer on the cruise meme, or going to the casino and just hitting the slot machines. A lot of people look at kind of the elderly generation in not just the United States, but the UK where you live and all across the West, and they see a generation that was blessed by a lot of material abundance, especially in the United States, and yet feels like they don't need to pass that down to their children. In fact, in many ways, we often hear, oh, well, if I hand money down to my children, if I leave something for my children, I'm spoiling them. I'm making them weak. I'm not making them fight for themselves. America, especially, but the West in general, is about cutting your own place in the world and proving yourself. And if I just hand money over to my children, am I not hamstringing their development? So, the easy straw man is, of course, the cruises and the casino trips. But, the more valid core is, what if handing money off to or other things off to my children is ultimately something that cripples their personal development and their ability to be an independent, productive person? So I guess the most basic question first, again, what should we be doing with our legacy? Why would an older generation want to pass down that wealth instead of doing something noble with it, like handing it to a charity who's going to do good work with that money as well?
Yeah, no, fantastic question. And I think essential. As you say, in a sense, it shouldn't be. But I think what has happened is that a lot of the terminology that we use, charity, philanthropy, meritocracy, nepotism, having earned something, birthright, these terms have gone through a revolution as we've moved from an agrarian society to an urbanized one. People now work entirely new professions. From a society in which generational wealth was the norm, to which the ultra wealthy are now first generation wealth typically. And from a Christian society underpinned by a rigorous theological tradition to a post-Christian society where a lot of these words have subtly different meaning. And I think what's happening now is a healthy thing to assume is goodwill on the part of all the participants. I think that's probably not universally true. But nevertheless, I think what is fundamentally happening is that the people operating, the people trying to find their way through this entirely new world, they're new to wealth themselves, are operating with confused terminology, without access to this rigorous theological, historical, philosophical foundation, which is actually a continuation of an ancient tradition in the West, and one that some families successfully persist to this day. So that's what I'm trying to recapture in the book, is for those families who do want to leave a legacy, to leave a family behind which is strong, loving, in which any wealth you do pass on to your children leaves them stronger, leaves them more empowered to start families of their own, leaves them more empowered to continue the charitable work that's important to you, to continue the strength of the family business. I want to give you the concepts to reason about that. I want to point you to the examples, the historic families in both the UK, in European history, and indeed in American history. Some of the great heroes of the book are of the American Protestant tradition, so that you can decide what the right path is for you. And ultimately, the concluding of the chapter really dives into this question of what legacy is, because I think that central question is also one that has been crippled by an impoverished discourse. So it's really about going back to fundamentals, anchoring it in the Christian tradition, in Christendom, in our mutual history, and allowing family leaders who are looking at what to do with their legacy and how to involve their children in it, the reasoning skills to do that in a way that makes sense to them.
Yeah, I appreciate that, because it really does have to go back to fundamentals. As we've both pointed out, throughout history, the core purpose for existence in most societies was having a lot of children and being able to pass things down to them. That's kind of the whole reason you did what you did. That was a motivating factor. Now, some of this is rhythm of life stuff, right? Like you had to kind of have children if you were married, if you were being intimate, that was going to happen. There weren't other options. You needed those tighter knit family units to survive. People had a much harder time being on their own. Multi-generational housing, neighborhoods, cares inside of clans or churches, these kind of things were far more common and necessary for survival. You didn't have the option of moving across the country and living on your own. You really did need to have that support, that multi-generational support of the family. And so I think a lot of those things came more instinctually when you don't have other options, right? It was just, this is how we live. This is the only way we can live. And so therefore we will live that way. And in so many ways, opportunity and options are the enemy of, wisdom and tradition, because they give you the possibility of kind of blowing those things up for a while without really feeling the consequences. But maybe we should lay out first why that ultimately fell away. Why did we go from societies that were deeply grounded in this idea that we needed to pass it on? And I think a lot of it is Christian. Of course, we need to be, as Christians, we definitely want to ground it in that theology. But obviously, we can see this trend across many different societies, those which are not Christian as well. This is just the way humans live throughout most of history. So what is it about this transition into modernity that has broken that chain of being, that chain of tradition between the old to the young, where we all felt that duty to each other and would have, kind of gone through the tasks that you're discussing in a very natural way most of the time?
I think the two main things that have changed in response to that question are charity and how we conceive of charity, and people's estates, so what they would be leaving to their children. To take the second one first, people's estates used to be very illiquid objects that brought with them duties as well as responsibilities. So they were the family business. In 1890, something like 90% of Americans were either small agrarian farmers themselves, or were employed by a family member on a family farm. And so when you pass that on, when that is the wealth that you pass on to your children, you are indeed making them richer in some abstract sense. You're handing them something of tremendous value, but it is necessarily something that isn't going to corrupt them, because it demands work of them. It demands stewardship. It demands cultivation. So you're giving them duties, responsibilities, seniority, stewardship, as well as wealth. Now we live in a highly financialized economy where a lot of people ultimately are able to pass on wealth in a form that brings none of those obligations. So if you look at the aristocracy equally of history, it's true that they didn't have to work in the same sense, but they were passing on estates which required management, which brought duties of the provision of security, the flourishing of the families and the communities that lived on their estates. They had obligations to host, to care for elderly relatives, to sustain the artistic and spiritual flourishing of the community more broadly. So again, even in this elite, sort of ultra high net worth aristocratic tradition, there is a version of this as well. Now, I don't think that's true. I think that a lot of people are in a situation where it is quite normal to accrue wealth through starting a business or rising up in a business and then liquidating your business, selling it, going to IPO, selling it to venture capital, and then ending up in a situation where at the end of your life or at a certain point in your life, when you're thinking about what to leave to your children, basically everything you have is quite liquid. It doesn't bring obligations. And so you are confronted with this question of, well, if I just dump a lot of cash in the lap of my 35-year-old son, is that not the equivalent of making a sort of lottery winner of him? And lottery winners tend to have very poor life outcomes because that liquid cash injection immediately robs them of purpose. It provides this huge wave of temptation towards idleness. It gives them these great questions because it suddenly shifts them in the trajectory of their life from one path in which they had a vision of where they were going to one in which they need to rethink everything from fundamentals. So it's quite a dislocating experience. And I think people rightly intuit that is a path that brings significant risks. So then they think, well, I'll leave enough for my child to go to college or whatever it is, but really I should be doing something that I can have more confidence will have positive effects. And that's where I think we come to the other thing, which is charity. Now, charity in Christendom, prior to the 19th and prior to the 20th century, charity in really every major Christian tradition was conceived of as a virtue. So it was much broader than just charity as giving money or giving resources to an institution. It was a diverse expression of this fundamental capacity of love. So charity is from the Latin caritas, which is the translation of the biblical Greek agape. And both of these are different characterizations, expressions of love. And so how charity is instantiated in sort of classic Christianity takes on multiple forms. It is true that it takes on almsgiving, so that's the giving of wealth to people in need and the giving of material goods, but it also has these diverse expressions, anything really that can be encapsulated by wanting what is best for your brother as a result of recognizing him as an aspect of God's creation due to your fundamental love of God. So an equally valid expression of charity can be sort of chastisement. It can be fraternal correction, going to a man who's living in sin and challenging him, and saying that's every bit as charitable as a financial donation. What I think happened and where these two trends intersect is you see with the rise of philanthropy in the States, this kind of competing movement, and there are various things that underpin this. One was the rise of the sort of Gilded Age magnates, men like Andrew Carnegie, who had this tremendous amount of wealth, but whose Christian sureness was on increasingly tenuous footing. He didn't go to church much. There was a slight commitment, but he was definitely not a Christian first and foremost. And they had this question of what to do with their wealth. They were first generation wealth. They didn't have family traditions. They didn't have these solid estates to pass on. They were sort of looking for what to do. And you had the rise of and the increasing dominance of these Enlightenment trends. So sociology, psychology, which offered the possibility of a more scientific approach to charity, right? So the idea that we don't just alleviate people's suffering, we use governance to discover the root causes of societal ills like poverty, which we can solve with this tremendous wealth. It's uncertain if that's happened. And then the two final factors I'd note are, there was a huge amount of societal upheaval in America at the time. This was the time when there was a transition from the agrarian society I mentioned to an urban, industrial, and professional one. There were huge waves of immigration into the United States via Ellis Island at the time. So you had this radical churn that uprooted this community-driven aspect of local love of brother to seeing these sort of great movements of people that did necessitate some kind of governance-like response. And that's really how charity got increasingly replaced by philanthropy. I think, unfortunately, what has happened now is that any distinction between those two conceptually in people's minds has been replaced. And people now think of philanthropy as the canonical expression of charity. And if you at least recognize that that's what you're doing and you do it intentionally and with the requisite knowledge, fair enough. But if you're a Christian and you believe that you're fulfilling your Christian duty by giving to the Gates Foundation in your will after your death, you're not. In fact, St. Basil the Great says explicitly that leaving riches to other parties after your death is not charity, because you're not giving away your money. Death is taking it away from you. You're not suffering, you're not sacrificing, you're not getting your hands dirty, you're not meeting your brother, you're not knowing and loving them. It's just a financial transaction. And I think, unfortunately, those trends have resulted in a huge amount of confusion. And so solving those kind of requires piecing together every aspect of the puzzle. What is charity? How can you pass on wealth to your children? How can you re-solidify your estates? And ultimately, how can you fulfill your charitable duty?
No, that's great. I've made this joke several times, but it certainly works here. America is in many ways haunted by kind of the shambling zombie animated figure of the fortunes accumulated by its venture capitalists, Carnegie and Ford and Vanderbilt. These all have foundations that are now radically progressive, undermining everything that these men believed in and worked for and fought for. And so these kind of disembodied fortunes have kind of turned like a golem on their master and have come for every one of these people eventually. And we can kind of see ultimately this attitude in charity being very deleterious, as you're talking about. It wouldn't be an episode of my show if I didn't get into bureaucracy and the effects of mass and scale. But obviously, once we shift charity out of being something an individual does, and as you very well point out, something that they suffer for, they personally sacrifice for, instead we make it something that you ship off to a disembodied or institution somewhere, some grand organization does everything on your behalf, then that money just goes into the black cube, right? And this is why so many people are frustrated, for instance, with religious charities in America right now. We have, Catholic charities and Lutheran charities that are actively looking to bring in as many immigrants as they can under the guise of being this Christian institution. And many churches who just kind of put money into a black box don't realize that they are funding this illegal activity. And so obviously, once you have that disconnect from the giver and the gift, you also lose accountability. And just like in any unaccountable large organization, it starts to go rogue. Also, just the fact that, one of the things that you talked about with aristocracy was handing off that responsibility. The gift came, you had to live a specific lifestyle. You could inherit, but you had to live a certain way. You couldn't inherit that and then just go become something else in some foreign land. The asset wasn't liquid. You could do this or do nothing at all. And that means that if you're going to assume that generational benefit, you're also going to have to assume a certain way of life, a certain set of responsibilities, duties. This is going to shape you into someone. So when you're giving to your progeny, when you're giving to your children, you are not just handing them stuff, you're handing them a way of life. You're handing them goals. You're handing them things that will build their character along with receiving that gift, which I think is so critical. And really the liquidity part is beautiful too, because you have to understand that, you weren't able to just turn whatever your parents gave you at 35 into like a serious heroin addiction. That wasn't an option when you couldn't just, everything couldn't be liquid, but now it entirely could be. And so that's a very difficult thing, I think, for a lot of people to handle, because, a lot of people were pointing to the current Ben Shapiro appearance where I don't know if you saw this, where he was talking about, you don't have the right to live where you grew up. You should just move and go somewhere else. And that just kind of throws all of that in the face, right? I think about Cologne and the ancient city, where he talks about the reason that they developed traditions, they developed the values, is literally because the religion believes that the ancestors are buried in the ground and you have to meet them there. You have to feed them. You have to give them drink. You have to care for them. And that's why you have property rights. It's not because you could go sell your farm. It's because literally that's where your family is buried. And if you don't have property rights, you can't do the religious rituals properly. And so the idea of selling the family farm was literally the idea of selling your ancestors, not just in a abstract sense, but in a very real sense. You are selling the plot of land where you were supposed to care for your ancestors. So it was a very strange development in Roman law when they eventually allowed for the contractual selling of these family farms, because originally that kind of right was founded on your ability to take care there. So I guess all that's a long rant to say, how do we reestablish this connection in a world where all these things have become liquid, where people like Ben Shapiro are saying, well, this is the tradition that you move and you leave and you go somewhere else, where we find rootedness, right? Being in the town you grew up in, that's for losers. That's a townie. That's a failure. You didn't move away to the big city. How do we change that mentality?
I'll give you two lines of thought. The first is property, which I'll discuss, but I do recognize that in a fundamentally meritocratic, mobile, changing society, people do have these pressures to move, and sometimes it is necessary to succumb to them. So I'll give some secondary thoughts about family businesses and other categories of asset as well. But I do think you have to start with land. There's a very interesting study I reference in the book called Trajectories of Aristocratic Wealth by Dr. Julian Bond and one of his colleagues. And what they show using the legal records of Britain's court system is that you're actually able to track very carefully how the fortunes of the great aristocratic British families change over hundreds of years anytime they go to probate, which is the inheritance legal apportion process in the UK. What they discover is that the oldest families have the greatest continuity of wealth growth over hundreds of years, whereas occasionally you get these ultra wealthy new industrial families or new business families that are awarded peerages as part of their honors due to their service or donations to their country, and they tend to flame out very quickly. So there is something about the landed gentry which is special, and I go into the book. I sort of give examples of why that might be, but this very much applies to America as well. I thought, if it's okay, I'll read a very short passage from Alexis de Tocqueville, which I think applies very closely to what you were saying. He says, amongst aristocratic nations, as families remain for centuries in the same condition, often on the same spot, all generations become, as it were, contemporaneous. A man almost always knows his forefathers and respects them. He thinks he already sees his remote descendants, and he loves them. He willingly imposes duties on himself towards the former and the latter, and he will frequently sacrifice his personal gratifications to those who went before and to those whom will come after him. So it's this kind of wonderful Burkean expression of the Fustel de Coulanges notion of pietas, of like ongoing duty to the locality of family. The idea is that an estate is this wonderfully illiquid asset, especially if you fill it with these kind of living embodiments of your family history, what the great men of your family have done with portraits and their artifacts, their hand-me-downs. Stephen Wolfe, the Protestant theologian, has this wonderful passage in his essay on Edmund Burke, in which he sort of says that a chair made by your grandfather is, as it were, a continuation of the presence of the maker. The world takes on this phenomenological adornment when your place is saturated with these expressions of the men who made you, and you sort of sense your place in this eternal rather than temporal moment, all generations, as it were, contemporaneous. So there is something special about land and the form of the estate. And I do think, this is something that I think that the current ultra rich are doing very wrong, is they're not commissioning art. They fail to have the ideals that is necessary to express through the intentional cultivation of artistic objects. They're not patronizing great artists because they don't have ideas and they don't have a tradition which has initiated them into the artistic world. So I think they're quite intimidated by it. So that's one thing. And then the second is the question of family businesses. Sometimes this is straightforward. Sometimes you have a successful, profitable family business, and multiple generations are initiated into it, and they continue with it because their families are good stewards of it. Ironically, the sort of Moltbuggian example of the New York Times is a good one here. They actually do a very good job of preserving the lineage of management of that institution. But there are quietly many sort of very, very profitable, very large companies that I draw upon in the book that do this quite well. For other people, this is more difficult. And it's difficult for a variety of reasons. Sometimes children are simply uninterested in inheriting the family business. In fact, this is a huge problem. And one of the great drivers of liquidity and churn in the economy is this phenomenon of basically boomers having built small, medium enterprises coming to the end of their lives and having to put them on the open market to random bidders because their children don't want them. And that's something interesting that I think is necessary to tackle. And I sort of explore how to initiate your children into a lifestyle of family business from a very young age, which is what aristocratic families do. Their upbringing is intentional. I talk about everything from the strategic utility of the birthday party, which is fundamentally an aristocratic tradition in which a child is presented to the community, expected to thank them and speak in front of them and so forth. So there's this initiation and life path for the young person starting from a very young age. It's not, okay, go off to college, study whatever subject you like, then go work for 10 years in a random different industry and gain some quote unquote experience. And then, by the way, you've got to come home and take over the electrical utilities business. At which point you discover, well, I have no affinity for this. There are other people in the industry that know way more than me. I feel like an imposter here. It's not part of my life story. I have to relocate. So it's this very intentional process. The third category I would say is some people have businesses which I think they intuit correctly are not well suited for any kind of dynastic structure. So if you've built a wildly profitable ChatGPT wrapper that is able to, by which I mean wrapper WRAPPER, not R.
Oh, now I'm disappointed. I was like, oh man, are we coding in some terrible lyrics?
No. Anyway, a kind of disposable software function that is able to generate outsized profits for a short amount of time, but is ultimately some kind of ephemeral resource. A lot of people in tech recognize that the things they're building are best sold at their peak, cashed in for liquid wealth, because they won't last regardless. I offer some reflections based on the great families and how they manage portfolios, and they tend to invest lasting institutions in specific businesses, which are natural monopolies. They're stable, they're of eternal relevance. I think resource extraction, other kinds of ultra long time horizon industries, forestry, land, commercial, residential, and agricultural, these kind of things. So if you intentionally transition your portfolio such that you have a portfolio of holdings which is well suited for the deep future, you can begin to lay those foundations. Now, I should say at this point, I do recognize that not every family is in a position to do this. I know your audience, as with my audience, skews young. A lot of these things aren't necessarily aspirational. I think to a degree that they're very much aspirational for myself as well. But by looking at how the great families have done this in depth, in a sort of diversity of angles, I think all of us can find some expression of how we could introduce more solidity and more togetherness into our own families to start building, to lay the foundations of that 1,000-year view.
Yeah, that's interesting. It answers a little bit of the next question I was going to ask, but I'll ask it anyway because there's more to it. I want to drill down on the family business thing particularly because, I grew up in what you could call the American kulak class, right? Like it's the class that is not going to be upper echelon wealthy, but came from a middle class or lower middle class, working class structure, and then moved up and made a good amount of money, built businesses. It's a lot of construction. It's a lot of these kind of water management, things that are quasi blue collar. They are physical labor, but they end up producing quite a bit of money. Plumbing, another one, that roofing, reliably making a good amount of money, even though it's not coded as wealthy. There's a strange disconnect too, because I know in the UK you guys have a more classic class structure. People know that class is not just tied to the amount of money you make. In the United States, it very much is. People think, oh, well, you hit a number of income and then you move to a different class. But that's not exactly the case. That's why, college professors making a third of what some guy who owns a tenth of what some guy who owns a car dealership, they still have a higher class. They're understood as being in a higher class, even though that car dealership owner is going to make way, way, way more money over time. But that is difficult, I think, for a lot of Americans, because there are, I think, a lot of people who move into that kulak class, who build the plumbing business, build the water management business, and then their kids don't want to move into it because it's considered low class, right? It's considered to not be something that builds you status, even though you're going to make way more money than you are with your psychology degree, right? Like that you're just going to be in a far better place, and you'd be part of that tradition. And what happens is, because of the lower level of interest, a lot of times, parents will just hire on people from outside. They'll bring in, sometimes illegal immigrants, because those jobs tend to be very manually taxing. And in other scenarios, they just want to scale quicker, right? So they'll start a small business and then it'll take off. And the goal isn't to build that business to generationally hand it down to your children. The goal is to scale that business up as big as possible, so then you can sell it for the highest price, and that kind of thing. So they immediately hand off duties to consultants or professional managers, these kind of things. The meritocracy, as it were, as opposed to that familial patronage that you would expect in previous generations. And so I guess, you touched on it a little bit, but just the sheer way that business is done now, the way people view business, it's all transitory. Again, it's all liquid, like we were talking about. The goals have radically shifted. It can be very difficult to hand over those positions in the way that you used to. Is there any way that we can kind of reinvigorate that tradition? Is there any way we can raise the status of handing down a business that is very profitable and ripe for generational wealth, but isn't considered a high status position? Is there anything we can do to encourage people to tie their businesses into their family, as opposed to just trying to scale them up and sell them as soon as possible? I know you said that, for instance, at some tech firms, it's just better to scale it up and send it out the door because it's not going to be worth anything in 10 years. But there are plenty of examples you can think of, retail chains and other things that people build, blow up in 10 years, and they've sold them off to investors, and their kids are never involved in any of this. Are there any good solutions to that, or is that just a condition of modernity? It's just the way our society is set up right now.
I'm going to make a few observations at the outset of attempting to answer this question, and I'll try and tie them all together in a second, because it's a very rich question. The first observation is that I think fundamentally the thrust of your question is correct, which is that you are, if you embark on this journey, fighting against macro societal forces, meritocracy, mobility, immigration. There are many different functional systems at play in society which are undermining the efforts that we're discussing. I still think you can succeed. The second observation I would make is that it is not inevitable that a family business which lies outside the remit of a sort of hot, popular area within a country cannot nevertheless be high status. If you think about the old aristocracy of the land, this was an aristocracy which was highly geographically dispersed. Typically, there was a lord of the manor or whatever that had a large holding estate, and he was the only person in his social class within that area. And the aristocracy, he considered himself a member of a distributed class that would congregate for particular events, the marriage season, the debutante balls, and so forth, the royal courts. But nevertheless, it was able to maintain the stable structure despite this dispersed geographic arrangement. Another observation I'd make is that status is not a singular thing. So it is true that status is a very fundamental need for humans, but we have different status as we move about our lives with different networks of people in different contexts. So I can be very high status to my children. I can be very high status in my workplace where I'm seen as very confident, but I can then go to an art exhibition and suddenly I'm embarrassed to even be there, despite all the people that look up to me elsewhere in the world, because I'm not seen as competent or a member of that particular clique. So status is this contextually integral thing. And so the question then becomes, is there a way that we could manipulate the fabric of society within a particular locality to afford status to the kinds of families that we're talking about in a way that, yes, although within the kind of lib-coded macro structure of society, working in one of these businesses in a region might not make you prestigious to the head of Harvard. Nevertheless, in their daily lives, they are interacting with people and families they respect who hold them in a position of esteem in a way that's very attractive. And I think that's viable. There are a lot of sort of TV shows, sort of rustic, red-coded TV shows that embody this kind of like local man of the town, man of the, head of the region. It is an aspirational vision. So to tie that all together, and this is really one of the reasons that I've written the book, is that I initially I was writing individual essays on parts of this, but it is so interwoven in order to arrive at a solution. Let me tie this back to charity as before. One of the arguments I make is that there are terrible downsides to exclusively engaging in the philanthropic model of charity, the sort of telescopic version or effective altruism, where you send money as far out of your own community as possible to the sort of mathematically most lives you can save. And as I show, that's a very short-term calculation, but nevertheless, most lives you can save in the moment, right? Malaria nets in Mozambique or whatever. One of the problems of that is that you undermine the integrity of the community immediately around you in a way that is in fact necessary to support the status and relationships and groundedness, and indeed the very health of the people that are necessary to perpetuate this model. So the final chapter of the book is a look at the sort of Christian tradition of locally rooted charity. In fact, let me indulge myself by reading one more St. Augustine quote, just because I like it, and I pull it out at any chance I get. He says, "Since you cannot be of assistance to everyone, those are especially to be cared for who are most closely bound to you by place, time, or opportunity, as if by chance, who in reality are chosen by God." So there is this sense of fate. There is this sense that you have a particular obligation. Don't tell J.D. Vance, but the Ordo Amoris is indeed a real thing. The sort of concentric circles of love. He was right about.
I think J.D. Vance was trying to tell the Pope, but yeah.
Yeah.
Kind of the other way around.
Let's not go there. Yeah. No, so
I'm a Protestant. I don't have to worry about it. Yeah, but go ahead.
I know. That's how this whole discussion falls off the rails really quickly. No. But they're, like I said, they're big Protestant heroes. In fact, really, the hero of the book is John Hancock, the first signer of the Declaration of Independence, and in my mind, a sort of moral icon of this vision of charity. But anyway, if you engage in this,
say why just for a second.
Absolutely, yeah. So, John Hancock was the wealthiest man in Boston of his time. So this was before the American Revolution. He was the nephew of a man called Thomas Hancock, who built a mercantile empire called the House of Hancock, which involved shipping, trade, shops, general goods stores, trade with the Caribbean, the British Empire. And he inherited that, and basically every aspect of his life embodies in a different way the kinds of things I talk about in the book. So he lived this life of tremendous temptation. He was initiated into this tremendous wealth after his father died, and he was taken in by his uncle. But because of the way that his uncle raised him, and because John Hancock rose to the challenge, he was able to absorb that new opportunity and direct it in very virtuous directions. He was able to both embody the often misunderstood aspects of aristocracy, and he was very much an American aristocrat, as it were. He wore the finest clothes, which he imported from Britain. But nevertheless, despite he had this very healthy relationship with money, in that he valued it tremendously, but he valued it not in and of itself, but because he recognized the changes he could bring about in the real world by deploying it well. So he greatly beautified his city, his house. He built this ornate mansion. But when the time came for him to support his people, the revolution broke out. He greatly impoverished himself through these huge donations to the patriots in terms of securing for them the stocks they needed to fight their war. Again, this is probably another fault line between us. You'll notice my British accent here, but I do respect him for his loyalty to his people. And there's this famous interaction in Congress where he instructs George Washington. He was the first president of Congress. He instructs George Washington, all the wealth I hold in the world is tied up in property in Boston. But if you must destroy the city in order to retake it, I give you my full goodwill. He has this very healthy relationship with wealth where he's willing to hold it when he recognizes good that can be done with it. And he's willing to let it go when he recognizes that there are greater ends to be achieved. But most of all, the thing that put me onto him is that one of the historians that immediately followed that period, I think it was Gordon Wood, recorded just this kind of throwaway line, which features in later biographies of other figures. John Hancock is a radically understudied figure in history. There was only a biography written of him for the first time in the 20th century. So for almost 200 years, nothing was written of him. Which was that over 1,000 families depended on John Hancock every day for their daily bread. And part of that was this virtuous stewardship of his business empire. He recognized that, rather than some abstract need to send money away to some, theoretical cause, the first and foremost thing he could do was the virtuous stewardship of the local economy to make sure that families were paid well, that the economy was well run, that jobs were growing. And whenever gaps formed in that, he would step in unhesitatingly. When his men died, he would send their sons through school. He's recorded as buying paupers out of debtors' prison. He made donations for new church bells, for new pews for the poor, for these embroidered Bibles to elevate his local churches. There's this hugely diverse array of very local charity and aesthetic expressions. He elevated Boston Common. And by the end of his life, Boston was recognized as one of the most beautiful cities in the New World as a result. So he's this very noble figure that I think had a very virtuous relationship to wealth. But to sort of tie that back to the point I was making, if no one is interested in holding status in a community which is in some very fundamental sense sick, both spiritually and physically. Like, no one wants to be the king of a drugged out town in rural nowhere. And I don't say that to condemn those people. I say that in order to express that we have a duty to those people and their physical and spiritual health. Right. Which is why local charity and raising up the community around you through these kind of diverse expressions of love to your neighbor is necessary, because that is, you are laying the foundation for status, for patronage, for mutual relationships of care, for the bonds of community, for the ultimate flourishing of where you are laying your roots. So that is that local vision of charity is intimately tied up with this question of dynasty and perseverance through time of the family estate.
No, and that's great. And I think it's so important, like you said, to have that understanding, that direct connection with who you're giving to and who you are helping. You know, personally, I try to, when I give charitably, I try to either give to people I know directly or to organizations that are working inside my community directly, knowing that that money is going to stay here and elevate the people around me first. And I think that is, even if you don't want to hand a giant chunk of money to your kids, remembering that they're keeping that local and making sure you're community focused with any giving that's not directly connected to your family, I think is really critical. Now, obviously, we've talked a lot about the financial aspects of leaving a legacy, which are important. I think that's where a lot of this is focused. But before we wrap up here, I do want to touch on the spiritual and the traditional aspect of this, because it's not just that older parents aren't passing on their fortunes or passing on their money, they're spending it on something or giving it away to abstract charities. It's that they're also not passing on their traditions. They're not passing on their faith. They're not passing on the family tree. They're not, they're not having you learn what your great-great-grandfather did and how he lived his life and how that reflects on your life. And these things, that chain is broken. Now, to be fair, in a lot of ways, that's because modern society, once again, has encouraged you to basically throw all that away. You're an individual. You're not tied to anyone. You don't have these responsibilities. But there is a lack of, I think, effort to make that central, to tell the narratives and the stories of who we are and why we do what we do and why we're tied to this church and this faith and this belief and this tradition. I was wondering if in the book you discuss this issue as well, how we as children, but then now many of us parents, can bring that sharing of legacy back, even though we've now skipped a generation. And I think many ways we've kind of broken that continuity. Can we reconnect those things? Is there a way to bring that back around?
So I hope so. And if it's okay, I'll indulge myself and read a very short passage from the book. But let me return to the question of ritual. Prompt me if I forget. Children must be conditioned to stretch forth their minds to do great things, to order the world around them, according to justice and charity, to take up the mantle as the spiritual and physical guardians of their people. A necessary component of this is imparting to children that this is what the great men of our family do and have always done. They must be given heroes, and the fact that they are the scions of these heroes inculcates in the young a feeling of responsibility in continuing their legacy and a sense of belief in children that they have what it takes to do it. Research and tell stories of the family members of whom you are proud. Commission portraits and statues of great members of your family, and hand on their heirlooms, treating them with such reverence that it cultivates a sense of awe in your children. Find beautiful frames and boxes for these objects. Honor ancestors on their birthdays or other occasions. all of this is to say it's sort of a return to a theme that we touched on earlier, which is that it is very important to do whatever you can to anchor your family. Sorry, I had my kid's birthday party earlier today, so there's like, you know, the wrapping paper all over the table. That's why I'm crinkling every time I move. It's very important wherever possible to elevate your family from mundane time into eternal time, to sort of recognize the perpetual nature of the struggles and sort of like foundational God-given created nature of existence. You know, in the church we have the liturgical calendar, which is a repeating cycle, which reinforces the eternal relevance of certain themes and figures and practices and traditions. Now, the centrality of ritual is very important here. If I might make an observation, which I think will anchor this thought in people's minds, Christmas is very much a ritual, which is a source of this tremendous psychological and spiritual sustenance for people, even now in a post-Christian culture. And it brings with it aesthetics, meaning, expectations, music, sight, sound, smells, practices, mass at midnight, the sense of expectation, and really all of these instantiated together into a practice which sort of elevates your vision both to higher things, but situates you in this eternal recurring time. You know, people love It's a Wonderful Life even now, when every other film of that age has been forgotten in popular culture, because it is eternally relevant. It speaks to some virtue, some feeling that recurs, and it challenges us to be as great as these men once were. So one of the things I recommend in the book is to find opportunities in any way you can, even from the most humble beginnings, to elevate your routines where appropriate into rituals, which is to say you take these pragmatic tasks that everyone has to do, and you find ways to endow them with symbol, with meaning, with aesthetics. And as such, you know, there's this line from Byung-Chul Han, who's this wonderful German-Korean philosopher, houses are homes in space while rituals are homes in time. And he's drawing on Antoine de Saint-Exupéry there, who's of a French aristocratic family, drawing upon his reminiscence of his father's palace and the liturgical calendar, where every footstep had a meaning. It's the sense of, it's a step back from the intensity of the moment and the flurry of everyday demands, to anchor oneself again in these eternal principles, and these things that never change. And so the combination of those two things, I think, is very powerful. You know, that the perpetual presence of your forefathers and the participation in the acts that you know they once did themselves, and that, you know, if you pass on to your children will continue to do after you're gone. It's another way of instantiating this continuity of time. And rituals, because they're enacted out, they sort of write themselves onto your body. It's not a vague belief, because beliefs can slip. Whereas something like Christmas, because it makes physical demands of people, because you have to, you know, even if it's impoverished now and the religious element is often lost, you have to buy the tree. It's not a proper Christmas if you don't have the tree. You have to wrap the presents. Everyone has to sit around it. You have to drink eggnog, whatever. There's this full set of embodied expectations that can't be ignored. So it's not just this kind of abstract thing. Finding ways to tie that into your everyday reality, and I give some examples in the book, I think is of the utmost importance. And even in secular literature, psychologists, it's well established that families that never do this, that never mark anything out as special, as of particular importance to their family and identity, suffer far higher rates of psychological crisis, because people move through life with a sense that of impending nihilism, that nothing is special and that they're not connected to anything. Whereas the opposite of that is that families that are ritual protected, as I say in the book, are quite the opposite. There's all these striking studies of children who are able to sort of return to their comforting rituals to move them through challenging moments. So that kind of temperamental stability, I think, is essential in the context of ultra long time horizon projects.
No, I agree, and you've set me up perfectly for my yearly Thanksgiving rant. So American Thanksgiving, guys, just want to say we eat turkey. Okay, I don't want to hear that it's dry. I want to hear that you'd prefer to have steak or lobster. No, this is Thanksgiving in America. We eat turkey. You can eat whatever you want on all the other days. You eat turkey today. You can have another meat on the side if you want, but tradition, you eat the turkey. I don't want to hear about how you barbecued something. I don't want to hear about all the different, Asian dishes. No, we make turkey. This is America. It's Thanksgiving. I don't want to hear about it. All right. So that's it. Johann, it's been great speaking with you. I think you're doing fantastic work. Again, it's one of those issues that should be obvious at some level, but we have gotten so far away from it that it's critical for a guy like you to reground this and to lay out the logical, moral, fiscal framework, just approaching it from the difficulties we have today and the kind of the broken chain and the way we can restore that. So I'm really glad that the book was written. Can you let people know the name of the book? Where can they find it? Show them a copy, everything.
Certainly, I have an author copy here. This is an advanced copy, so it's marked up. I apologize, but it's called Leaving a Legacy: Inheritance, Charity, and Thousand-Year Families. Thanksgiving is coming up. It might make an excellent gift for the patriarch or matriarch of your own family. But yeah, it's on Amazon. That's where you can find it. You can get it in ebook, paperback or hardcover, as you prefer. And yeah, I write at becomingnoble.substack.com. But I'm here to shill the book, so please do check it out. I worked very hard on it.
Well, and I know the temptation is for every Zoomer and every millennial out there to grab as many copies as they can and give it to every boomer they see, just chucking it at boomers in the retirement center. But you need to read this too, guys. I made an episode a while ago called "You're the Boomer Now," which is you have to be careful not to fall into this same trap. You can't decry all this. Oh, I didn't get things passed down to me. The generations before me didn't do the work, and then you don't do it. Like you must break that cycle if you actually want things to change. Which means you need this book just as much as your parents or grandparents do. So make sure that you're checking it out. And of course, if it's your first time on this channel, you need to click subscribe on YouTube, bell and notifications so you know when we go live. Sorry, this one isn't live today. This is pre-recorded, so we will not be able to answer super chats. I'll make sure to put that at the beginning of the episode as well in chat. And of course, if you would like to get these broadcasts as podcasts, you need to subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on your favorite podcast platform. If you do, leave a rating or review. It really helps the algorithm magic. Thank you, everybody, for watching. And as always, I will talk to you next time.